When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers.
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Hello and welcome to Race Haven.
Radio.
Hello and welcome to Race Haven, the radio show and podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race in America. My name is Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse race, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to lead a movement towards racial harmony in America. So, for today's show, we have 2 topics, and I also have a guest. And the topics today are going to be this is episode. Well, first of all, this is episode 3 of Race Haven, and today we're going to dialogue about the belief that we can eliminate race-based issues in America if we just stop talking about race. We are also going to dialogue about whether we should or should not have an African American History Month, and the question I have is celebrating African American history divisive? So today I have one and potentially 2 wonderful guests. Right now we have one guest and the other may be calling in shortly. But I have Mr. Denny Fairclough, who's an entrepreneur who lives in Georgia. How are you doing today, Denny?
Doing great. How about yourself, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing awesome. Doing awesome. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And a little bit later, we'll be joined by Dr. Osvaldo Gaitan, and he's a psychiatrist who lives in Texas. So call in now to share your perspective on these topics by dialing 929-477-4107, then press 1, and I'll know that you want to speak. If you're listening online, be sure to visit and join our Race Haven Facebook group and share any thoughts, questions, or comments during today's show and dialogue with our online community, and I may get a chance to share some online thoughts during the show as well. So to start things off, let's provide a framework for authentic dialogue. In authentic dialogue, participants listen with a sense of curiosity. Participants ask questions to uncover the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind someone's statements. Participants communicate their thoughts openly and honestly while putting aside emotions, defensiveness, and a desire to be right. And participants approach someone who sees a problem differently, not as an adversary, but as a colleague in common pursuit of better solutions. So my colleague, Mr. Denny Fairclough, and I are going to model dialogue today for you on the show. And at some point, we'll have Dr. Gaitan, as I call him, Dr. Oz, provide some perspective from a psychiatrist's social behavioral point of view. So let's get right into it. You ready, Denny?
I'm ready.
Awesome. So to kind of frame our first topic, recently, last year, there was a video that resurfaced of a 60 Minutes interview with the anchor and a famous African-American actor, Mr. Morgan Freeman. And in their interview, Mr. Freeman said that the way that we end racism is to stop talking about it. And there were a whole lot of, reactions in the media and social media. And, I wanted to start off today's conversation with touching on that topic because I've seen it over and over through my timeline on Facebook where there'll be a racial discussion and some of my peers will say something to the extent of, the way that we end this is if we stop talking about it. So I wanted to go ahead and get your perspective on that, Denny. So what's your thoughts on that topic?
Well, I think it depends on the context, and having I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, in a predominantly African American community in my neighborhood, but then I went to a private Baptist school up until maybe second or third grade, and then I went to public school and then back to private school, and then through middle school was in public school. So, I had this really interesting dynamic where I was, at home surrounded by, mostly African Americans, and at school mostly European or white Americans, and then, bounced back and forth between public and private school. And I think, I try my best to understand, the different opinions or perspectives on the issue. And I think I even personally have experienced it, racism in general on a certain level, knowing what it's like to be the minority in that neighborhood and in that public school and how I felt. So I really do try to look at it from the other perspective, which is why I really appreciate you inviting me on today and for being, as open and transparent as you are and encouraging this kind of dialogue. So I think from this perspective, you and I talking about it and people that come together with open hearts and open minds in order to discuss it is one thing. It can be very positive. I think what leads to the argument, the defensiveness, the bitterness, the wanting to, shut down the conversation is oftentimes, I think, the framework I feel like that we're being, when I say we, the white people, are being blamed for it as a whole, when maybe we personally don't have those same feelings, don't have that same perspective, and don't agree with maybe what the general media, the way they frame it. So it's not that I don't think the dialogue can be healthy. When I say I think, if we'd stop talking about racism, there wouldn't be so much racism, I mean, I think we're a little quick to call it racism, and when we do, I feel like it's in a very blaming and judgmental way that makes someone feel like they're being attacked when maybe they don't feel like they're being the aggressor. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. So basically what I'm hearing you say is a segment of European Americans feel like that when race is brought into every issue, they feel like they're being attacked. Is that the gist of your point there?
Yeah, there's two parts of it. I think one point is that when you cry wolf so often, that when there's really a wolf, you're almost immune to it or numb. So I feel like racism is injected into so many conversations where it may or may not actually be the case, and it's often used to maybe afford someone's personal or political agenda, to the point where when there is a legitimate issue concerning race or racism, it gets lost in all the noise because we've tried to use it when it's not necessarily applicable. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is, like you said, when it is brought into the conversation, it's framed from a perspective that, everyone's guilty of it, and if you're white, you agree with all the white people, and that if you're black, you agree with the black people, and that we have to be on opposing sides of the argument regardless of who framed the argument.
Okay. So are you speaking to, there's a term that I hear often, that when people say stop using the race card, I get into dialogues with people. Well, most of the time it's not a dialogue. In my head it is, but in theirs it's more of a debate or argument. When I jump onto threads on Facebook, and these people don't know me, but I'm commenting and asking questions and trying to, be a little bit, dialogue. Like you know who I am. Everyone who's listening to this show, you understand the mission behind this show. You understand how I am. So when I hear things like, you're using the race card, I want to understand from your perspective, what are they trying to say? Is it more in line with what you just said in terms of what the race card is?
Well, I think the race card, that terminology can be used in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I would say a lot of times if someone feels like it's not a racial issue, but yet it's being made, and when I say someone feels like, I'm, just because you and I are talking, we'll use us as an example. I know you, so you're genuinely trying to get at the core of the matter and kind of what makes people think the way they think and feel the way they feel and say what they say. And if someone's you're on a thread and the other person doesn't know you, then obviously they don't understand that that's the angle from which you're approaching it, which is a very honest and genuine angle. So I think when someone's perception is that it's not a racial issue, which that's their own personal perception, and someone else's perception is that it is a race issue, then they're going to pull out that, race card type conversation, which obviously is designed to shut down the conversation, not facilitate dialogue.
Okay. I appreciate that perspective and going and giving us those insights. What I want to do right now is I want to welcome Dr. Osvaldo Gaitan, who's also a guest host today. How are you today, Dr. Oz?
Doing pretty well.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And I wanted to, ask you to, Denny and I, we've just been going into the topic of the day, which is the belief that we can eliminate race-based issues in America if we just stop talking about race. And the way I framed this is when a year ago, I'm not sure if you saw it, but there was a clip going around with Morgan Freeman on 60 Minutes when he said that the way that we stop racism is to stop talking about it. So, Dr. Oz, could you provide any perspective into, what you see regarding this topic? And the reason, to add some context for the audience, I wanted Dr. Oz on because Dr. Oz, first of all, I think he has a unique perspective because he's a psychiatrist and he studies human behavior. Okay, and the other thing that I think is unique is that Dr. Oz, because he's not African American or European American, he's been on the outside looking into that dynamic that we've had in this country, based on our history. So I think he can give a less biased, insights as well. So, again, I appreciate you for jumping on, Dr. Oz. And do you have any insights that you would like to share with us at this point?
Sure. Since you know me, just to clarify for the audience, I was born in El Paso, raised in Juarez for a few years, then came over and did all of my schooling here in the United States. So essentially, I'm a first-generation American. My culture is obviously Mexican, and growing up in El Paso, it's like 95% Mexican Americans and Latinos. So that's the perspective that I came from. And then I had a lot of training, through school to recognize patterns of behavior. I also have a PhD in neuropharmacology, so I understand the studies that are out there as well and the information that gives us. What I noticed when the first things that struck me when you guys were discussing the issue is I think a very common mistake that we can start off with. I think Denny was saying that people feel attacked when people bring up the race card because they don't feel like they're being racist themselves. And I think we've talked about this before. The first point that I want to make is an individual cannot be racist. They can be prejudiced towards something, but they cannot be racist. It requires a system to be racist. And when people are bringing out and pointing out, I've noticed most of the time people are pointing out systemic issues that are racist, and then people personalize it, which is also a very common thing. It's part of the group that you're in, so you automatically personalize it and say, well, I look at myself and I don't feel like I'm being prejudiced in this situation. And especially when you're part of the majority culture and you have privileges based on systemic racism, it makes an underlying association of guilt that you may have because you've either never recognized it or you'd rather not recognize it. And like most people assume that when an individual overcomes things, it's the individual that's the most important thing, not so much the forces of the system. And I think that really creates a lot of disparity in our ability to converse about race and racism in this country, is because we all make that mistake. We personalize it instead of depersonalizing it and looking at the systemic racism that occurs. And when somebody pulls a race card, if they're doing it correctly, what they should be doing is pointing out the systemic racism and the person's experience of the systemic racism, and also pointing out if somebody from majority culture has some kind of privilege because of that. And everything that we're discussing here is actually part of human nature. Whether people believe it or not, and I don't see how they cannot nowadays, is that slavery was a multi-generational traumatic experience. I see it all the time when I deal with patients who are stuck in a family system where the parent was abused and that parent was abused by their parent. And it becomes this cycle that perpetuates itself. And the major power of those systems to continue to work either through the family or through our government, through institutions, or through educational systems is the desire not to talk about the issue, is to keep everything secret, to hide the shame. And Danny is partly right, as well as when you participate in the conversation of blame, and it's because of you guys that I'm this way, that also perpetuates the system to keep it going. So there's certainly valid points to be made on both sides, and I think that's what really bothers a lot of people, is that some people sit there and say, well, I hear the truth in what this person's saying. So when somebody says, if all you do is talk about what happened to your ancestors, but you're the individual in front of me, then you're not taking responsibility for your actions. And we hear that and we say that makes sense. But at the same time, you also have to be able to hear the fact that, but I am stuck in this system. I'm stuck in this family where there's been trauma. I'm stuck in this culture that was traumatized for hundreds of years, generation upon generation upon generation. And when people are bringing that up, they're just talking about societal forces, and they're talking about how those societal forces affect them. And that's when you can get progress, is when you start to look at those, and it's important to talk about them. The worst thing that can happen is not to talk about the issues, pretend it didn't happen, especially because we as the younger generation were not born like our parents were while discrimination was still actively going on. While the movements of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, everybody else had to address those issues. But that's only one generation ago. For us, who are in our 40s, our parents grew up during that generation. So yeah, go ahead.
Let me jump in there, Dr. Oz. You're saying so many good pointers, and I want to allow both Denny and I to kind of add to and ask questions, and then you can obviously jump back in. So let me first just make a point that as someone who is African American, I can admit that there are times where I see certain African American people who may say that something is racism when it actually isn't. So I can understand. I think Denny gave a great example when he used the cry, the boy who cried wolf, example. And I think that there's a lot of that goes on, and it's definitely an issue. It's definitely a problem. And I can see how some people may just turn it all off and become numb to what actual prejudice or racism is. And then to speak to that point, and I'm actually going to do a show on that, coming soon, where we're actually going to break down the differences between racism, prejudice, and bias, because I think that that's a very important first step to us fixing these issues, is that first we have to acknowledge and come to a conclusion on the differences between the three, because it is a difference. And unfortunately, we use racism the wrong way. And I'll say, even myself, I used racism the wrong way up until a year ago when I was made aware, by participating in dialogue through our Race Haven Forum and continuing to educate myself. I stumbled upon a video where a sociologist explained the differences. So then I went online and I Googled, the sociologist's definition of racism, and I saw other supporting documents to confirm what she was conveying, and it made sense. So, and I feel like I really feel like if we could all understand that would solve a lot of issues. If people really understood the difference between systemic racism and prejudice, that would be the genesis to solving a lot of these issues. So my first question is for Denny. So Denny, I noticed that there's a segment of European Americans who they don't acknowledge systemic racism. From your perspective, have you had any conversations, in any of your social circles where you could say that, systemic racism is not something that is clearly understood? Do you understand what systemic racism is? It's still an issue?
Well, I can't say that I fully understand it from the perspective that if you ask me to, define it, that I could. But if I'm to understand both of your question and Dr. Oz's, kind of clarification, you're referring to the system. In other words, maybe not the individual person that is, exhibiting prejudicial, emotions or thoughts or actions, but the overall group or organization or the system. So when you're talking about racism from that perspective, I've actually never, can't say that I've never thought of it, but I never thought of it in that context, and can admit that based off of some of his clarification that I do take it, I do personalize it because I'm part of the group, meaning I am white, right? So an attack on that whole concept is an attack on me. I've never thought about it from the perspective that the system, whether it's the government, the police, the taxes, the jail, whatever system you're referring to, education, being, having racism built into it.
Can I give you an example?
I don't know that I have an example because I've never
I was saying, can I give you an example really quick?
Yeah.
And then you can elaborate. So when I say systemic racism, you named a couple of them. So one, let's talk about education. Systemic racism is in the and this is just as far as back as I go. In the 1980s, for example, when I was in elementary school, I attended an elementary school that had inadequate books. The HVAC, like the school was always cold or extremely hot. Like we just had windows. We didn't have like central air or anything like that. We were in a very old building. And, as a kid, I didn't notice this, but, going forward, you heard about how these schools can never retain the best teachers or get the best teachers and things like that, even though I thought my teachers were great. But just in terms of also in education, as an African American growing up, the majority of the texts were written in a way that some deemed to be culturally biased. We always learned about European American stories and European American history, and the books that were shipped to us were from a European American perspective. And the only time we got insights into our history is because a teacher, went out of their way to bring that perspective in. So we, as African Americans, it felt like the system was rigged to kind of keep us down. And in the judicial system, the same thing with the judicial system. There's a lot of statistics out there that speak to some of the disproportionate tactics in terms of the arrests and, so forth and so on. Even more recently, but even going back to history, I watched a documentary on PBS. It was called The New Jim Crow, or something to that effect. And there's a book out called The New Jim Crow, and it spoke about how after slavery was over, and I may have named that book wrong. There's a video that spoke to how a documentary that spoke to how when slavery was over, in the South especially, they started arresting African American men and putting them into hard labor penitentiary systems to get the free labor from them at that time. Like literally, an African American could jaywalk, and they would put them in jail for 20 years. And there's like numerous stories, and there were videos, and there were documentation, and there was first-person accounts about in the 1920s, 30s, 40s about how these transgressions were enacted on African American people. And when people say, "Oh, well, that was many years ago," well, guess what? My grandfather was born in 1920, so he was a teenager in the 1930s. And if he would have been, a victim of one of those things, that would have affected me today. I wouldn't have been able to have what I have. My grandfather, went on to go to college after going to the military and raising himself pretty much, putting himself into the military, having the American story, the amazing American story, and then putting all his kids through college. And then that impacted my generation. But imagine if my grandfather would have been locked up on some trumped-up charges because he grew up in the South, and how that would impact my generation today. So I know I was going to give you a short explanation, but that's just an example of what systemic racism is. So because that happened to so many, there's people living today who are still feeling that pain. And then also I can go on and on, but I'll stop there. Do you have any thoughts to that on that?
I do. And everything you said, I agree is valid, and obviously generation upon generation can be affected in a positive or a negative way by, their actions and what's happened to them. And I also went to elementary school in the 80s, and as I shared, I bounced back and forth between a private Christian school and a public, school that was, I just looked it up, and even today it's 84% African American, 11% white, and the rest is the rest. So, I was the minority in that school, but I never thought about the perspective of what was written in the books and what we were taught in the class. And when I'm honest with myself, listening to you describe it, what I guess maybe gives me even more of a different perspective is I'm a libertarian. So I believe in individual rights, and the doctor brought it up a few minutes ago. So I am very much an individualist and look at it from the perspective of the only person I can control is myself, and therefore I control my own destiny. And it's not what happens to me, it's how I react to what happens to me. And I personally believe that even today, even if what's in our textbooks aren't slanted towards, white or black, it's not just a racial thing. I believe our public school system is designed to teach everyone what the government wants them to think, which is why I believe in local curriculums and people in the community being able to develop their children the way they want to develop them. So I never thought about it from a racial perspective. Growing up in a system where the books talked all about European Americans and our history and the history of the country from their perspective, so I can totally see where that can have a lasting impact on many generations. As far as your grandfather's concerned, I think what troubles me personally when we have conversations about what happened to your grandfather is that I struggle with what we do about it. In other words, I can recognize that people that grew up in the time that your grandfather grew up were treated inappropriately and that were, enslaved through different means other than just slavery, because that was the way they used to extract their labor, and how that could have a lasting impact on him, his kids, and you, his grandkids. And while, he created a great story and enrolled in the military and sent all his kids to college, and you got educated, and you're a successful guy, and there were other people that didn't have that same experience. There were people that got arrested for jaywalking and put to work, put into a prison system. and how their future generations might not be in the same situation you are because of what happened to their grandparents. I can accept and recognize that happened. I think what troubles me is what that has to do with me and what we're supposed to do about it now. Because for me, as a individualist and a libertarian, the smallest minority in the world is the individual. And making me personally atone for something that I didn't do to you or anyone else troubles me. Now, that might not be the reason it troubles other people, because in my social circles, yes, I know people who are just ignorant because they're uninformed. I know others who are prejudiced, even though they don't want to admit it. And I know people who are probably just, would rather not even think about it and won't even consider a different perspective and doesn't even want to address it. So, but for me personally, I can look at a situation that you described, completely admit that it is wrong or that it was wrong and that it did happen, and then where I appreciate this dialogue and I'm open to is like, what do we do about it now?
Right. That's awesome. And as we're dialoguing, you just asked the question, and I want to say don't please ask me questions as well. I know I'm kind of facilitating, but if you have any other questions to kind of extract anything from me, please ask. And so, Dr. Oz, I'd like you to jump back in, to kind of speak to some of the things that Denny just said.
I mean, those are very interesting points that he brought up, and I think they're very common ones. And I think when people come at it from a good heart saying, look, I know personally some African Americans who grew up in really hard situations and overcame them. I'm pretty much living the American dream. I come from a very poor background, inner city, where people, only 64% dropout rate in the high school that I went to, and yet I have an MD, PhD. I make a good living, and hopefully the next generations that come forward will continue to do so. And that is great to put value on the individual. I think what Denny's trying to point out is also a very common thing that we do is we individualize our achievements and don't recognize the system that we're coming from. And it's a very natural thing to want to forget the shame of multi-generational trauma that occurred. However, there are long-lasting effects that came from all those institutionalized laws, and what we can do as individuals is start looking at the system. Stop personalizing our successes, start personalizing our failures, and taking them and putting them in the group of racism. Those are all prejudice and bias. Racism has to do with the fact that because of generation upon generation of trauma and slavery, you ended up with a culture that had very little value to education. Individuals within that culture could make the correct choices and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but what about the people who were left behind and were still traumatized? There's even been genetic studies that show that part of it is also who's resilient and who's not, and part of that is the genes that you have, and they tend to run in families as well. For example, the effects of multi-generational trauma have been linked to people from the Holocaust, as well as people who have multiple generations of slavery, and also people who are have multiple generations of sexual abuse or physical abuse handed down, that their stress hormones axes are off. That certain parts of their receptors in their brain are just different and are expressed differently because of all the generations of trauma. They're more likely to have certain parts of their brain not work as well as other parts of the brain. Their brain just looks differently when you put them underneath imaging studies. And these are people who were just the product of previous generations of trauma. And that even controls, even if your generation and your experience is not as traumatic, you still are more likely than the general population to have these issues. And they've pretty much correlated also to who's resilient and who's not. And because really, even the study of resiliency has come up with the fact that some people can experience the exact same thing. Like for our generation, the most relevant thing we can bring up is the experience of 9/11. You have people who were in the middle of 9/11 and never showed a single PTSD symptom afterwards, were able to go on with the rest of their lives. You have people who just saw it on TV, weren't even there, and even to this date have nightmares, flashbacks, so part of it is your own temperament, your own genes, as to how much trauma can affect you. Because I think we all know the world through our own individual experiences. So that's why there is power in the individual, like Danny says. And, and we say, well, look, this is the way I experienced it. But most of us who succeeded were probably already resilient to begin with, or came from a system that allow us to be resilient, regardless of our upbringing and where we were. So what we can do as individuals is not shy away from the conversations, get to the center of what's actually perpetuating the continuation of this multi-generational trauma or discrimination and systemic racism. For example, economic issues, the educational disparities. And when we have gotten forth as individuals and made it, not to turn our back on the people who haven't made it, and not to say that just because we made it, that those forces are not real.
Okay, well, let me jump in, because Denny said something really important when he said that, he hadn't really given it thought, when it came to something like a systemic racism. And then he also stated that some of his, some people in his peer group or social circles are flat out, just apathetic to the whole issue because it's not something that affects them on a daily. That's an assumption that because it's not something that affects them on a daily basis, they don't really have to think about it. Obviously, because of the numbers and European Americans being the majority in this country, they don't experience their race the way that others do. An analogy I like to use is that a fish doesn't realize it's in the ocean. So with that being said, when the question is asked, how do we fix it? I believe just by having these conversations and exploring different angles and hearing each other's thoughts, there's no easy way to it. But my question is, how do we do that if a large percentage of people don't even want to hear it? Like, they don't even want to take the time. For example, there was a conversation on Facebook yesterday, and I jumped in. It was about the whole Beyonce and Black Panther thing, and we're not going to get into that deep because that's going to be next week's show. I'm going to have a daughter of a Black Panther on, and hopefully someone else to bring a different perspective. But I was dialoguing with a European American friend, and all of her friends jumped on were all European American, and they were all kind of they showed a video that was bashing Beyonce and asked for that perspective. So they all kind of had perspectives. Some, understood, and then some had some mean things to say. So anyway, I jumped on and offered a perspective. I was the only African American on the thread, and the lady said to me, "Where'd you get your research from? Al Sharpton?" And immediately discrediting me as someone who could think for themselves, as someone who cared, and immediately went to a common line that I've seen throughout, especially when people, they kind of retreat back to their politics in terms of, oh, you're just a liberal, so that's why you say that, and or something like, oh, you must listen to Al Sharpton, things like that. So it's like, how do we get past those things when you have people who don't have the patience or even care to discuss it, or when our political frame of references and mental models inform our opinions and don't even give some people the time of day because they don't even feel like it's relevant. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I can tell you we've been involved in some of those threads. Like, for example, there was that one thread about the picture of 9/11 and then the one about a slave with lashes on his back. And, somebody was inflammatorily put those two pictures together. And one of the things I pointed out was all the disparities, that you're not comparing apples to apples. And the only thing we can do is, we live in a society right now that likes little phrases that, their attention span is not very long. So when they hear something that aligns with their own fears, because I think that's really what it comes down to, is we're afraid of what we don't know. We also don't like, as Danny pointed out, that, we're the children of people who are involved in those systems, but we ourselves did not participate 40 or 60 years ago in what occurred, and we'd all like to believe that we would have walked with Martin Luther King, or if your temperament is more along the Panthers, you could have gone with them. We all like to believe we would make those choices, and we don't want to take part of the blame at all. I mean, because it feels like we're being attacked, and I think as individuals, that's what happens when you just look at it as an individual. So the best thing we can do is when we come up with that kind of ignorance, or what is it called, idioms, when people just throw them out there at you, is to challenge them. But to challenge them from an actual calm point of view, so that they have a new emotional experience with somebody. Because usually what ends up happening, people, get down into going back and forth to each other with, that's because you're a liberal, that's because you're a Republican, that's because you're black, that's because you're white. They're just labels in which we each assign our own fears, our own dislikes to them, instead of, and then when you react in an emotional manner, you're just participating in perpetuating miscommunication. So when you see it, call it out for what it is. I said, I just heard a flashpoint that's supposed to elicit some emotion from me. Did you notice that it was brought up? Instead of reacting with, why'd you call me that? You give them a new experience that people realize it's possible to have these conversations in an educated, calm manner. And you can even get emotional sometimes, but that you can look at the core issues that are actually going on. What is perpetuating the continued economic, educational disparities that are institutionalized racism that are mainly based on economic pressures, but also based on racial pressures? And when you get down to those issues, that's what's going to help.
Okay. Denny, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that, your views as a libertarian may contrast with some of the things that Dr. Oz said. So obviously you see the value in having this dialogue because you jumped on with it today. Based on your social circles and what do you think can be a solution? Do you think that if dialogue is the solution, do you think there's a way for us to kind of put our religion and our politics and our cultural and racial backgrounds to the side and bring people together, discussion, so that we can understand each other a little better? Do you think that that's a part of the solution, and do you think that's even possible?
Do I think it's possible? I guess anything's possible. Probable, a different story, and I think that religion, politics, and our cultural backgrounds are so ingrained into us, which is why, obviously, generations of slavery and injustice can affect generations to follow, because it's that ingrained in you. So, do I think we can put that aside and solve the issue? I mean, that's why I'm on the phone. I think when you frame it in order for racism and race to go away, we have to just stop talking about it. No, I believe we need to talk about it, but I think it's the way that we frame the conversation, and I don't even remotely pretend to know how you can get people to talk about such an emotionally charged issue like we are today, and put down those religious, political, and cultural beliefs. I think it's I don't want to call it insurmountable, but it's a very large challenge, which is why it's such a big issue today, even generations later. So, I don't know. And as a libertarian, speaking at it from a political front, I fight with Democrats and Republicans, so I'm just by nature, the worst person to have these conversations with, because I don't get along with anyone.
Okay. Well, I'll just share that, first of all, I appreciate both of your perspectives. And, the reason why that I do this is because I was enlightened, with a concept called dialogue. And the more I began to learn about it, I realized that this is indeed the solution. When I look at the tenets of dialogue, I know that it can work. And then one of those tenets is dialogue calls for temporarily suspending one's beliefs. And debate calls for, just to contrast, because I think a lot of times we learn better through contrast, debate calls for investing wholeheartedly in one's beliefs. So it takes the willingness to temporarily, suspend all those beliefs that we just talked about and speaking to the issue. It also takes the willingness to step back from an issue and kind of put the issue, if we were kind of visualizing we were in a circle, and putting the issue in the middle of the circle and then taking our emotions and our feelings away, but then working together to solve the issue. Taking a 10,000-foot view of the issue. Doing things like that. And there are a lot of techniques in the psychological social studies world, sociology world with doing these things. I know Dr. Oz is well-versed. And it's just like, how do we get this to the masses? And there is no easy now answer, but I can tell you guys what, today was a part of it. Because in my mind, even if 5 people listen to this, and even if one heart was open, was expanded, one perspective was expanded, then we're participating in a solution. And I think that's what it's all about. So to close out, your
goal was one. You got me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk with you about this in an environment like you've created. And Dr. Oz, I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us and providing, a different perspective. And I can honestly say that I've probably got more out of this conversation than anyone. So thanks again.
Actually, we all got something out of this. I want to make sure you understand that, Denny, because I thought you articulated your viewpoint extremely well. And the one thing I think what you were discussing and putting it in perspective as to what dialogue is and one of the techniques that we learn about, one of the things that happens to traumatized individuals or to anybody who's been traumatized by having a racial dialogue at all is the fact that you go to what's called splitting. It's a basic defense mechanism where something's either all good or all bad, which is why you get people attacking each other and holding on to their beliefs. And the key to argue against splitting is the ability, as you become more mature or as you become more open-minded about a subject, is to recognize the truths in both sides of the argument and believe that they can both be there at the same time, that you can hold both of those viewpoints at the same time and become part of a larger truth. To accept the truth, the fact that sometimes people do pull the race card when they shouldn't, to accept the fact that people are genetically and physiologically affected by all the slavery that occurred and it's not going away anytime soon, that these are all facts that can be accepted and taken as part of the larger whole, and that's where true growth is going to come.
And I also want to state that a lot of times people tend to think that these type of dialogues are, for African Americans to get their feelings out so that they can be heard. And I want to say that one of the most important things in order for Race Haven to be successful is that we need more European American perspectives. We need to hear European Americans say things like what Denny said in terms of, I don't want to feel like I'm the victim. I don't want to feel like I'm responsible for things that were done in the past, and also understand why he feels that way. I think that that's also an important part of the dialogue, because we also need to hear things like, when X is said, it feels like every European American is being attacked. I think those things need to be said and heard, and I think we need to continue to do the work and continue to have these conversations and continue to have those things come out. Because as Dr. Oz said, we all have our truths. We all have our truths. However, I think it is our responsibility as a generation, if we're going to make things better for the next generation and our kids so that they don't have to turn on the news or open up social media to continue to face these things in the way that we do, it's our responsibility to work towards a collective truth, because that's what it's all about. everyone's voice is relevant. Everyone has something to say and beliefs and truths. And I think it's important that we mold those and kind of bring them together and glue them together. So I see that we have a caller that wants to say a few things before we close out here. So I'm going to allow the caller to come in to share, ask a question, or share any thoughts. So caller, if you could just share your name. I see your phone number ends in 4600. It begins with area code 314. Let's see here. Okay, caller, what is your name and where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Mr. Pianki. I'm calling from the St. Louis area, not too far from Ferguson. How are you today?
We're doing great. Thank you for calling in. Welcome to the dialogue. What would you like to share or ask today?
Well, I was going to share this. I think that these race relations conferences and dialogue is basically a waste of time. And I have enough years behind me in living in areas that I can substantiate that. Why do we try to change people's minds on how they feel? When, in essence, they really, unless they break the law, if they have negative feelings about you, or don't like you, there's nothing wrong with that. You have those on the far right, those on the left, and those in the middle. And I never would let my children participate in those, and I didn't participate in them. There was much other things, better things that was needed to be done that would effectively change the socioeconomic status, in this case, of blacks and African Americans. So, no, what's to be gained out of these conferences, these discussions? I've been hearing about these discussions for decades, and I wonder if you could tell me, what is someone supposed to say?
Okay.
If you could
Sure. Sure, and I'm going to answer your question, and thank you for calling in, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your perspective.
And so, could I hang on in case I wanted to question you for one more time? Go ahead. Okay,
so I want to say that from my perspective, the way I hold these dialogues, and the reason why I do this when I know there's the thought process that you have, is because historically speaking, because I am a student of history and I read a lot and I watch a lot of documentaries, I know that during the time of slavery, there were people who thought slavery would never end. There were people who felt like there's no way we can change the mindset of Americans. And we know the outcome of that, because there were people who refused to believe that, who were abolitionists, who were both European and African Americans, who fought for decades, over 50 years of pushing an abolitionist agenda before they saw the outcome they wanted, but they were steadfast. And then we go to civil rights, and all the civil rights leaders and the freedom writers and et cetera, there's a million names even beyond Dr. King who played a part in that, who, you know, where people said, why shake the boat? Everything's fine. It is what it is. There were African American people who felt that way and European American people who felt like things were okay. Why are people causing trouble? But they were steadfast, and they were able to make things better for the next generation. That's why I think that it's important to have these dialogues, because now it's not as overt as it was in those times. It's more of a subconscious issues. But the reason why I know it's still an issue is because we have these hot button issues that always hit the media. And then as soon as they hit the media, you see people going and taking sides. And then you see the dialogue coming from, or the conversations and debates coming from both sides. And there's very few people speaking with each other, taking the time to really understand, like we're doing today.
Could I say something on those points? You mentioned two things about the ending of slavery. Slavery ended because of economic reasons. Dr. King, during the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and there was a dispute between King on one side and the Nation of Islam, which was a decade earlier, was the largest employer of African Americans in this country. King basically wanted for blacks to have the full access to what their civil rights afforded them. You can't change people's mind. If a person is a racist, you know that there's nothing illegal about being a racist, a segregation, a discriminatory person, as long as you do not violate a U.S. citizen's civil right. and that is true. So
Okay.
King was not the whole idea of trying to change people's minds. What they saw and people in the North seen is that blacks in the South was not being afforded their rights, like the right to vote, the right to for public accommodation, which goes back during the time of Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's basically what you can't change people's hearts.
All right, and for the sake of time, but for the sake of time, I appreciate your perspective, and I'll let any of our guests respond really quickly before we close out. And I just want to say really quickly that the goal of this dialogue is not to change minds and change hearts. That's not the goal. The goal is just to simply share perspectives and listen, okay, with the hopes that we can expand our perspectives and expand our hearts to include differing perspectives. All right. And I'm sorry, did one of my guests hosts want to jump in really quick?
I'm going to let the doctor tackle that one, but I will say before I'll keep it brief before I turn it over that I don't think we're trying to change hearts and minds. I think that's a very challenging, process and can take years and decades to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I do think once somebody kind of makes up their mind and they have no intentions of listening to or wanting to, look at it from a different perspective, of course you can't change that person's mind. But what, in my opinion, this forum does is the bigger population hasn't made up their mind. Their heart is open, whether they're younger, older, or in between. If they have questions and are searching for answers and are in a state of mind where they are open to influence and want the information, then I think calls like this and this dialogue can ensure that, that they don't develop those prejudice, views, that they do understand there's other perspectives, that they can hear it from, different angles and different sides and different truths and different facts, and they can formulate, a more well-rounded view of the world. So, I think these conversations, you're never going to change someone's mind if it's closed, but if it's opened, you can absolutely influence it.
And I think that's called a corrective emotional growth that you would get through therapy and through these kinds of processes that's going to help at the end overcome so many generations of trauma that have occurred in our society here in the United States, that slavery, it's its dirty shame, and that the continued discrimination and institutionalized discrimination towards the minorities, which I consider it mainly an economic issue as well as a skin color issue and a cultural issue, that these are the kinds of things when you open up somebody's mind to what you were saying earlier is the collective truth. The collective truth will come with the education and the opening up of minds that it's the institutionalized racism that needs to be addressed, and we all need to agree is there. Once we all agree is there, as our caller pointed out, then you can do pragmatic things to fix that. Then you start asking, instead of trying to change people's minds, let's pragmatically give people economic power, educational, get rid of the educational disparities, and the rest will take care of itself.
Awesome. I agree. And I appreciate everyone's thoughts and perspectives. That's our time for today. I want to thank everyone for listening, and I want to thank our caller for calling in to share his perspective with us. And I want to give a special thank you to our guest host today, Denny Faircloth and Dr. Oz. Denny, first you can tell our listeners, how they can connect with you and any final thoughts that you want to share with them.
Sure. My email's easy. It's mail@dennyfaircloth.com. But if you'd like to connect with me, I'm on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and there's only one of me, so it's DENNYFAIRCLOTH. If you type that into about any social media site, you can find me pretty easily.
Awesome. Thank you, Denny. And Dr. Oz, how can our listeners connect with you if they like?
My name's Osvaldo Gaitan, Osvaldo Gaitan, Gaytan. I obviously have a Facebook, personal account, but certainly one good way to communicate with me is I'm constantly on Race Haven. I'd like to encourage everybody out there to join us, especially those of you who have opposing viewpoints and want to be heard, so that we can question what's underneath all of that, so we can all grow in our knowledge and learn each other's truths. And that's really what this is all about. That's where healing is going to come from, is understanding what underlies all these issues. And, any way that I can help people do that, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Oz. And, excuse me, Dr. Oz was referencing our Facebook group, which can be found on Facebook at Race Haven, Solutions Focused Dialogue about Race in America. Simply join the group and we'll accept you. It's a closed group, but once you request to join, we'll accept you and you can join the dialogue, and diverse perspectives are always wanted. And one of the things that I say all the time is don't be frustrated, ask questions, okay? And, whenever we have these hot button racial issues that hit the news, everyone comes out with their frustration. And I just wish people would ask questions and listen. And that's how we could all learn and grow. And that's what we're going to attempt to do here each and every week on Thursdays at 12 noon. So be sure to join us next Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time for another exciting dialogue. The next topic will be posted soon on Facebook and blogtalkradio.com/racehaven. So be sure to follow the show there. You could also listen to a recording of today's show at blogtalkradio.com/racehaven. Racehaven is a safe place for people from diverse race, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to lead a movement towards racial harmony in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Episode 3 of Race Haven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app, which is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks because you both are so busy? Do you neglect calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then 5 for Friends is the solution. 5 for Friends is a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends 5 minutes at a time. Simply invite all of your family and friends to download the app, and whenever you feel like talking, instead of playing phone tag, speaking to voicemail, or getting caught on a long phone call, you simply open the app, tap a button that says, I got 5, and a notification goes out to your family and friends, and you can connect with whoever calls you for a free 5-minute call from anywhere in the world. When there's 30 seconds remaining on your call, you and your friend will hear a beep to let you know the call is about to end. And then when the 5 minutes is up, you'll hear a polite closing message that says, thank you for connecting with 5 for Friends. So visit 5forfriends.com. That's the number 5, FOR friends.com, or your app store to download and try it today. Peace.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers.
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 480p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers.
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 480p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.